body, mind, business still is the theme, plus relationships, spirituality, and what's changed and who we've been over the past year. We've achieved, what the challenges have been. Once we've done that, just recap on some of the general trends that are occurring, advancements in longevity, what's going on in the workplace, in business. And based on that, we'll start to take that into context, both who we've been, who we want to be, what's happening in the outside world, and then start to sort of reimagine how it could be for the forthcoming year. There's a few things to remember. And the first one is we think about is what we become. But interestingly, it's what we're feeling that creates our thoughts as well. So it's emotions, even more so, underpinning everything. Emotions dictate what we actually believe. Even if we don't consciously believe something, if our emotions are telling us that we're not good enough, that we're not worthy, that we're not capable, that it's unlikely to work. If we have a subconscious story that, oh, no, you tried that before and it didn't work. We have those stories, it's so like it's all over our body. Those emotions will completely dictate what we think about. And then consequently, that will dictate what action we take. So what we feel creates our thoughts. And what we believe is what we create. So working on our beliefs is a really, really important strategy rather than knowing, the right action to take. Another thing was about our identity. If you act as if until you become, so acting as if already embody all of the qualities that you admire, you become whatever it is the identity name that you gave yourself. Another thing, Joe Dispenza concept, that your personality creates your personal reality, and that your personality is how you think, how you feel, and how you act. So this whole thing of, what comes first, thinking and feeling and thinking, is a loop. But we are born with feelings. We are born with chemicals. Our biology sort of embodies our DNA and what happened to us, even in the womb. So it's very, very deeply embedded. And we also spoke a lot about baseline standards. We always default down to our minimum standard, whether that is body, whether it is that emotions, whether that's money, whether that's time management, how we're treated in relationships. Every single aspect of our life comes down to what we will and won't tolerate, and what we do and don't believe we are worthy of. So it's that thermostat concept, isn't it? The lower and upper limits. And we did lots of work on trying to examine what is our lower limit. And different people have different limits. Some people would never go overdrawn. Some people would very happily go overdrawn, but only to a certain amount. Others would go overdrawn and then get loans. It's very, very individual. There's no right answer. I'm just going to let the dog out. 2 secs. And the same goes for everything, in life, like I say, whether it is how our body is, how athletic we feel. The other thing that I just wanted to refresh our mind about was the whole makeup of the brain and the fact that we are driven by fear and survival. So, we've got this back of the brain, amygdala, tiny little prehistoric element of our brain, which is basically trying to keep us alive, and consequently is fearful of everything, fearful of every decision, fearful of getting up off the sofa and making a phone call, going for an interview, fearful of reaching out to a new client, fearful of standing on a stage, fearful even of going to the gym, becoming, fitter than all our friends, fearful of sometimes investing, spending money. We're driven by fear, but being aware of it, we learned lots of different ways of being able to manage that, to calm that fear. But that's the first part of the brain. And then the second part, before you even get to conscious thoughts and feelings, is the whole subconscious mind, which, as I said, is very much full of stories about what will and won't work. Subconscious mind can know the answer to something for us before we, about 7 seconds before we even get to a point where we can think of something, consciously think of it. So this whole story about that's not going to work for you, so don't even bother trying. This story is our subconscious mind, and it is all based around feelings. It's all what's in our body. If we can start to be aware of our subconscious mind by getting into it, by meditating, by doing some of the things that we've used, things like tapping, and understand what's on in our subconscious mind, and that's called healing. And you do become calmer, you do become less fearful, you do become more in control of your own destiny because you can stay in what Tony Robbins calls a beautiful state. But a lot of that is being aware of what's going on in your subconscious mind, doing the work, and gradually people do start to say to you, wow, you're so calm, nothing rattles you. How do you stay consistent? And it's because we do this work and we overcome the stories about what's possible. And then the third part of the brain is really what most of us think is the brain, the conscious mind. But even the conscious mind is made up of two parts, the logical, they call it, I don't know if you've seen the book, The Chimp Paradox, but the monkey brain. So we could be looking at, are we going to eat a certain meal or not? And the logical mind says no, because it's this many calories and it's not going to hit my macros and blah, blah, blah. And the emotional brain says, oh no, but I really want it. It's going to be really nice. In our conscious brain, we are constantly driven by a dialogue and by questions. So I agree with what's being said here. Oh, I'm not really sure, like that dialogue. And it's full of primary questions. And we talked and we did quite a lot on primary questions and what would be empowering questions versus what might be disempowering questions. Why questions? Why is it always like this? Why does this never work? Those are disempowering questions. The how can I move forward? Who can help me? What could I do next are the empowering questions. And that all goes on in the conscious mind. But so it's very complex, this brain of ours. And I thought that we could start, before we sort of start sharing, could get you just to reflect on some of these things. So I'm going to just give you a few questions to think about. They're along the lines that I sent out in the longevity group, but they all revolve around who we were last year. I'm going to ask you these questions and get you just to make a few notes. Okay, so first thing I'd ask you about last year. Now we're talking about a whole year. So do try to reflect back a little bit because it's easy just to think about how we feel now or how we feel last week. We're going to come on to how we feel now, but really just try to think about who was your leading personality for most of last year. Could be one or two, but who was the personality? Do you remember that we talked about all the different personalities that show up and then they tend to run the day? Sometimes we have the confident ones, sometimes we have the guilty ones, sometimes we have the angry, controlling ones, sometimes we have the sexy, flirty, fun one. All these different personas that we've all got. So if you really think about your personality last year, who was the leading personality? Write down what springs to mind, because I'm going to ask for some shares after. Next thing to ask you is, what was your primary question? If you really think about questions, did they tend to be the why questions, the what questions, the how questions, the who questions? What were your primary questions? What things? And normally when you are trying to figure out something, what's the question that comes to you most? The next question is, where were you mainly? And again, I know it's hard to generalize, but have a stab at this. Where were you mainly on the emotional scale? Do you remember the emotional scale that we looked at, where at the very top, we've got joy and gratitude, and they go all the way down to disillusionment and frustration, and then they go further down to blame and envy, and they go further down to anger, and they go further down to despair, all the way down. So, and if you remember, there were two halves of the emotional scale. So where were you primarily, would you say, on that emotional scale? Because all of this contributes to who we were last year. And then other questions to dwell on that you might just want to make a few notes on here are, firstly, what were your primary beliefs about yourself, your life, your business this year that's gone by? And in summary, as a before we jump onto the next set of questions, who would you say, now you've thought about this, was the name of the identity that actually ran the show for most of the year? If you remember the identity work that we did, we talked about who she was, how she looked, what her habits were, how she felt, what she believed, how she spoke, how she held herself, what she tolerated, her minimum standards. All right, so before we move into the things that she did, the things that, she achieved, the challenges, etc. So let's not go there yet. But anyone want to share about their identity? When you look at that, because so often when we look at the past and sort of a series of events, we talk about the externals, but we don't really talk about who we were being within it. And so much of the work that we do, and it's work in progress, it's challenging, but it's so rewarding, is trying to decide who we're going to be and then to be that person regardless of external situation. But it's so easy to allow the situation to pull out other aspects of our personality, because of course we are all those personalities. So anyone else want to share who they were? When we are further up the emotional scale, when we recognize our boundaries, when we understand what's going on in terms of our feelings, like you've mentioned, guilt, and we think that we feel a certain way because of circumstances. And in fact, we can get our head around the fact that circumstances occur very much because we feel a certain way. They're not everything. And even if we feel on top of the world and we stay at the top of the emotional scale, life is life. We are human beings and things are going to happen, but it's how we deal with it. Evelyn, did you want to add anything else? In contact with our emotions, isn't it? And the reason that those emotions are there is probably less important than knowing that they're there and then having some tools to be able to work through them. So getting back to our notes again, then, if you can come up with a name for the identity that ran last year primarily, that would be good. You may actually say, well, actually, it was. Do you remember we did the identity work where we had one that was, she was not the one we wanted. She was the one who would be stressed, unhappy, guilty, controlling, whatever you want to say. There's one there that we think, oh, it's her again. We don't want her there. She's not the one to run the show. She's not going to be the one to achieve everything we want. And then you've got our idealistic identity, the one we're working towards until we become her. And most of us had names for both. I think I talked to you about having different versions, your version 5.0, 5.1, 5.2, 6.2, 6.3, 4.3, whatever it is, depending on how old we are. But also associated with those versions can be names. And I think I've said to you before, I've had several reincarnations of names which embody all of those qualities and all of those habits and all of those beliefs. And actually, I've always had a photo for me of myself, which actually embodies that particular person at the time. In fact, one, I even had a painting, so, and when you have that photo, you can look and think, oh, there she is. So when you go back over the year, what identity primarily rang your year? If it's one that you want, brilliant, we're going to take her forward. If it's one that you recognize from previous years who is not the one that you want to embody, then we just want to be very aware of her. We want to know what triggers her to show up so that we can watch out for her next time. Other things that I wanted to ask you, how did the previous learnings from all those gurus that I brought together impact, your journey last year? So we had Tony Robbins, we had Joe Dispenza, we had Peter Diamandis talking about longevity at length. We had Earl Nightingale, like I said, Joseph Campbell, Napoleon Hill. I mean, there were many, many. Esther Hicks. There were lots and lots of different gurus that we, touched on their work as the years went by. And so, who in particular resonated, if anyone? Be interested to know that, because could be that. And then summarizing, before we share that, what would you say would be the biggest challenge that identity overcame last year? Some of you have already mentioned it, but what's the biggest challenge that they overcame? And as a result of that challenge, what sort of growth came out of it? What sort of growth and resilience came out of it? And so therefore, how do we develop last year? Because one of the things that we all are driven to have, as we know, is certainty, isn't it? We all want certainty. And unfortunately, because we are human and because life happens, we can't get certainty about our external environment. But if we can aim to get certainty about how we are going to be within any circumstance, that then really, really helps to subside and calm the fear element of the brain, calms down the story, the subconscious, and enables us to make less emotional and more logical decisions about who we're going to be. So when you think about your challenge last year, your biggest challenge last year, if you can associate with it what growth came out of it, what resilience came out of it, and therefore just reflect on how much extra certainty has come out of it. There's examples, but there would be many. So it's just interesting to reflect on who's influenced you a lot, because, I certainly go through, I'm sort of like a bit of a binge listener, and I find someone and I listen to them. I listen to everything. I read everything, and then I'll go to the next one. And then, I'll occasionally, I tried to do it. I think I've even showed you before, my bookshelves are arranged in body, mind, business. And, I'll sort of keep jumping between and then I'll revisit. So anyone else?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, this is a lovely time to say, okay, so who was running the show mostly? What were the challenges? Having overcome challenges, or at least lived to see another day, i.e. today, even if those challenges are still ongoing, what have I learned? How much more resilient have I become? And consequently, who am I now? Who am I now? Who am I going to be for this next phase? Who am I going to be? What personalities am I going to bring up? And embodied in that is a number of things. I mean, firstly, it's going to be the habits, because I think a couple of you said, in order to sort of change the way you felt about something, or it may be savers, or it may be journaling, or whatever it is, what are the habits that really help you to get to the place where you need to be emotionally, to actually embody that identity that's chosen. So what are those habits? And a reminder of knowing that those habits work, knowing that they get you to the personality that you need to get to, that you want to be in. Think about how can you start to build those into your day again. And what are the thoughts that we want to have as well? So knowing what the emotional scale is and where we want to be and what the tools are to get there, then what thoughts do we want to have? Because the thoughts will then direct the actions. So rather than going at it from, okay, I must do this and I must do that and I must do the other, thinking about who we're going to be, what the tools are to get to that point in terms of our feelings. The emotions that we feel, we inherit a lot of them, especially they're inherited the same as our DNA. So we are conscious of them even when we're in the womb. But emotions actually create chemicals. They create neuropeptides. Neuropeptides come out of the brain and drop into the body. And if we don't release those, they just stay there. They stay in the tissues and the glands and the organs, and they just stay there as trapped emotion. And we're just totally unaware of it until we get triggered by something. And unless we do the work to recognize it and release it, most humans just wander around with those and die with them. And they're then perpetuated in subsequent generations. I think if you get into a state of mind that is at the top of that emotional scale, then doesn't matter what's going to be on our list for things to achieve, whether it is a house or a car or new relationship or whatever it is, if we can start to be certain just exactly as we are and have that certainty and feel, all of those human needs already, feel that excitement about life, feel love and connection, feel progression, contribution, just as we are today, and be okay whether we get the stuff or don't get the stuff, then that's an amazing place to be. And bizarrely, that means that we probably get the stuff more easily. What I've wanted with this group, and certainly with you guys, we've always been ahead of the curve. So, if we take, for example, Steve Bartlett, he's podcasts, very often when he's interviewing, especially maybe not so much now, but let's just say a year ago, he would treat some stuff as if it was brand new information. And yet we would have been looking at this like 2 and 3 years ago. So I like to think that we are slightly ahead of the curve. And that's really where we want to stay. We want to try and stay just that little bit. We don't have to stay miles ahead because then it's too, no one sort of knows what we're talking about. But just to stay a little bit ahead of the curve means that we can implement things. So in no particular order, these are some of the things that I wrote down. I mean, the first one is the whole area of epigenetic programming. We are not what we've inherited. We are not only our DNA. The scientific studies vary, but it's generally agreed that less than 20% of who we are and what we are and how we're going to be is down to DNA. And the vast majority of who we are and how we are and our lifespan and our health span is down to lifestyle changes. And that's epigenetics, basically. And so once you believe that, then you start to embody it. And I think we're probably all really great examples of that. But the more that we can explore that, understand that, or that we're going to have a lengthy health span as well as lifespan. So that's a big area. Senolytic therapies is another area. There are a lot of medications coming out. I wouldn't recommend necessarily taking any yet, but there's one called Qualia Senolytic. And what they do is over a couple of days, they actually kill all the dead cells in your body, called zombie cells, these cells. They sort of stay there. And they're the ones that if they don't get moved and cleansed away, they pile up like piles of rubbish and they can cause, cancers and disease. So that's one of the main causes of disease, apparently. So there's a lot of work on these particular types of drugs. So I'm not asking necessarily for anyone to do anything, and I certainly wouldn't take them yet, but keep an eye because those therapies are very, very advanced. Another one is personalized nutrition. Now, I've talked a lot to you about blood markers and the fact that, I very rarely say to anyone what supplements to take because the supplements that suit me are not going to be the supplements that suit anybody else. But I'm a very, very big advocate, as I've said to you before, to get your bloods taken. If there was one thing that I would say, rather than taking any supplements, is to get your bloods checked. Because as Peter Diamandis advocates, don't die of something stupid. And if you get your bloods checked, and it's so cheap to get them done now, ask for a full blood panel and you ask for a well woman and they will give you everything to do with the functioning of all your major organs. They will tell you the complete reading of all your blood in terms of your red and white blood cells. They will talk about the arteries and your propensity to have heart disease, and they will talk about your balance of all of your different vitamins and minerals, your hormone levels. So it's just a full blood panel, and I would say quarterly because we change so quickly. Personalized nutrition based on a tailored approach based in terms of the future of work. Obviously, we've got AI in the integration of AI with what we're doing. And who here is using ChatGPT, or easier, who's not? So I would advocate just using it every day. It is absolutely crazy. My son's got a business where he's got AI customer service agents that he sold to so many organizations, hairdressers and, anyone who wants to have an appointment, for example, customer service, car organizations that have, garages that have cars in for service, all that sort of stuff. So it is crazy what AI is capable of now. So if you're not using it in your everyday life and in your work, then just start doing it. It's going to ultimately be done by machines. So when we dwell on that and we start thinking, what, really? Even like operations, yes. Even hairdressing and hair color, yes. Even nails, yes. I mean, like everything. Maybe a robot can't actually say, I sort of feel that your energy's down today. Are you okay? I'm not sure if a robot will be able to do that yet. The potential for us to be unemployed is greater now than it ever was, and that's nothing to do with our capabilities and everything to do with what's going on in the world. So keeping an eye on that and how it might implicate us, I think very advisable. Other things, the whole live shopping movement now. You can't go on TikTok without looking at live shopping, even Instagram live shopping, Facebook live shopping. So when you think about what you're doing as a business, is there any potential for live shopping? Yes, there is. What comes with that is the ability to present online, to speak online. If you look at all of us now, we're just so comfortable speaking online, which we found it weird, didn't we, 4 years ago? But very, very soon, if we are wanting to have any sort of type of storefront, we'll be speaking on video and selling online and buying online live. So it'll be beyond just online shopping, it'll be live shopping. Another thing I pulled out was sustainable and tech integrated fashion and clothing. So, sustainable sources of clothing, clothing that's probably good for us, is not made of chemicals, which is bad for us because we're absorbing all these chemicals into the skin. In fact, things that are good for us. So they call them smart textiles. So that's going to be a big move. Obviously, we're going to have driverless cars, driverless vehicles, probably driverless planes. And so where does that leave us as humans? Sort of the big question, and trying to sort of explore that without fear, but just with a sort of, an interested, confident mind that we're going to fit in where appropriate and life's going to be better, not worse. And that's the whole concept of humanness, isn't it? What are the skills we want to develop so that we can actually financially sustain this lengthy health span that we're going to have. So any thoughts on that? Any of that? Many people won't be thinking about it, be blissfully unaware, or don't even want to think about it. So I think that when we do examine these areas that which are, I'm going to help us do over the coming months, see for a fair bit, as I have now, you can actually go in there. One of the really fascinating things to do is to say to it, based on what you know about me, based on all my interests, what would you say would be my strengths, my weaknesses? What would you say that would be a good direction for me to take professionally? I mean, you can ask any questions. It would be like going to the very, very best therapist, or the very, very best career advisor once you've used it a lot, because it stores everything, which is sort of partly frightening. You can't take its answers on face value, because if you ask it some technical questions and it misses out a step, like you have to ask a few times, are you sure? And what about this? And what about that? And I've actually said to it before, well, why did you miss out that thing? And it just says, oh, we're sorry about that. And it doesn't give you a reason why it's missed it out. It may not pick up all the things off the internet. It may not scour the internet in its entirety. So anyone else want to add anything about that? Really, the takeaway from this at the moment is I just would say keep an open mind. I'd really encourage you to just, be aware of developments in technology and AI, just looking at the headlines, really. I think I've said to you before that I subscribe to The Economist, and that's where I get most of my headlines. But I don't think we can ignore it. But I would caution about being worried about it. But I definitely think it will pay to be aware because things are moving so fast. And I don't think it's something that we're going to be able to ignore, no matter how professional and experienced and expert we are in our field. So the only other part that I wanted to cover today was if you've got particular objectives and goals for this forthcoming year, personally or professionally, that you wanted to share, that you wanted to have, particular help with. One of the lovely things about what's happening in the world is that we don't have to say I'm a anything anymore. Traditionally you'd meet someone and they would say, "Oh, what do you do?" And you would say, "Oh, I'm a something. I'm an events organizer, or I'm a lawyer, or and if you couldn't say you're an a something, you would feel somewhat less than. Whereas now, I think it's interesting to say that I do lots of things. You don't have to be in a box anymore. And this has really only been a shift, I think, since COVID. You can talk about what you do, but that's not what you are. That makes it really exciting because depending on who you talk to, you could be a PT, you can be a therapist, you can be an artist, you can be a healer, can be, a digital expert, whatever it is, you can be these things if you decide you want to put yourself in a box for that conversation. But really, we're not, we're just our own separate individual human beings. And that's what makes it so exciting. We can do lots of things. So I'm going to poll you on a number of subjects so that I can see what the most popular subjects are to delve into for the sessions. But also, I really want you to use the WhatsApp group and the Saturday sessions as well to have conversations, any conversations that you want to have. So even though we're on a workout, we don't only have to talk about macros and exercises in the gaps in between the sets. We can to dwell on the identity that we were in, to think about the tools that are at our disposal that we know work for us, and think about how we can make sure that we use those a bit more in the upcoming year, to think about the identity that we want to embody, that we are in the process of creating, and to focus on being that person more than doing the stuff. That doesn't mean to say don't do the action, of course, but I think if we can remember that 80% is psychology and 20% is strategy, I think we'll see some even more significant changes. And if it's body that you want to change, the same thing applies. Right then. Thank you very much.